In his prescient novel, 1984, George Orwell argued that the control of language is a means by which governments and other totalitarian agencies, cultural organizing bodies like the media, language is the means by which we control the narrative, the agenda, the way we control people. It's interesting that here we are in 2024, and language is becoming the battlefield for control in our culture. What does the Bible have to say about this? Yuri Berliner was in the news recently. He was an executive for National Public Radio who found himself in hot water because he wrote an essay that basically lets the cat out of the bag. He says out loud what most of us have known for years, and that is that the elite media in this country, particularly National Public Radio, skews dramatically to the left in the messaging that they are determined to provide for their audience. Berliner committed what the network considers to be treason by identifying the liberal bias in the newsroom and then arguing that it's not just a leaning, but it's an actual purposeful agenda. In fact, in the article that he wrote that got him in such hot water, he cites multiple studies of National Public Radio listeners indicating that the vast majority of their listeners have a lot of education and lean to the left. That's who they target. But Berliner did the research of the leadership within NPR. While 67% of listeners describe themselves as very or somewhat liberal, 100% of those within the structure that makes content decisions about what the radio network broadcasts are considered very liberal or progressive. In fact, he checked voter registration lists and determined that the net number of Republicans who work in the NPR newsroom is, wait for it, zero. Zero. Not one Republican, not one conservative on the payroll. He goes on to say what's notable is the extent to which people at every level of NPR have comfortably coalesced around the progressive worldview. In other words, they've created their own bubble where they can't imagine any viewpoint other than the one they all hold because it's the only viewpoint allowed within the organization. NPR, over recent years, they've always been left-leaning, but over recent years, it has become a little bit more aggressive. They now regularly reference pregnant people. The network's transgender coverage guidance document calls for no references to biological sex at all. They have a structure built into their system called the Marginalized Genders and Intersex People of Color Mentorship Program, which means they highlight aspects of the most minor intersectional people groups within our culture and elevate those as though they are the standards by which culture needs to be measured. In other words, the cat he let out of the bag was NPR is driven entirely these days by identity politics. In fact, anything that you say that is ideologically wayward from the party line will cause an NPR employee to be entered into a dispute process with another part of their structure called the DEI Accountability Committee. Those are fancy names, but it's the same thing that we saw in the early part of the 20th century in Soviet Russia and later in the mid part of the 20th century in Red China. That is, committees that monitored speech and called you to account if what you said didn't toe the party line. Berliner was first given 5 days of unpaid leave because of his revelations of the progressive and extremely liberal bias of NPR, as though we didn't know. He went on to eventually announce his resignation and leave NPR because he said he couldn't work in an environment where where he was under constant surveillance and threats for his career because he had the audacity to say what the bosses didn't want said out loud. Well, that's just one example. President Biden is another. A few weeks ago, when the president delivered his State of the Union address, he was heckled by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. And in response to her, the president was talking about the murder of Laken Riley, an American citizen who was killed by an illegal alien. And as the president spoke about that, Marjorie Taylor Greene heckled him from the audience. Now, I'm not condoning her behavior, but in the course of that back and forth exchange, the president, I think caught off guard, made the statement that he acknowledged that Riley was killed by an illegal. Well, red flags went up everywhere, and as quickly as the post-State of the Union interview, the president was given the opportunity to walk back those comments. In fact, almost before the president could leave the chamber of Congress, Representative Joaquin Castro gave an interview that said the president's choice of words, calling this suspected murderer an illegal, he said those choice of words are highly problematic for many people on the left because he said it was dangerously close to language from Donald Trump that puts a target on the backs of Latinos everywhere. Okay, watch what we're doing here. To refer to one individual as illegal is to put a target on the back of Latinos everywhere. Drama and overreaction much? Well, as the president went to his post-State of the Union interview, the interviewer said, during your response to Representative Taylor Greene, you used the word illegal when talking about the man who allegedly killed Laken Riley. President Biden didn't even wait for an actual question to be formed before he responded. He knew what was coming, and he interrupted and said apologetically, undocumented. An undocumented person. I shouldn't have used illegal. I should have said it's undocumented. The interviewer said, so you regret using that word, to which President Biden responded, yes. And with that, the immigration part of the interview was over. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is we now see 6 million border crossings on our southern border in the 3 years that Joseph Biden has been president of the United States. The southern border, just from a logistical and policy standpoint, really you don't have to have any great position that you hold on the great issues of our day to simply say from an organizational and logistical standpoint, what's happening on the southern border is chaos. I mean, even if we wanted to let all those 6 million people in, there has to be a better way to do it than what's happening here. We are being invaded, and the president is not apologizing for the absolute disaster of the policies of his administration related to the border. What he's apologizing for is he made a language error. He called this man illegal, and he said, I should have called him undocumented. Now see, here's the problem. The problem with the word undocumented, when it comes to this particular man who is Laken Riley's alleged killer, is in fact that he is anything but undocumented. In fact, the outrage over his situation is due in large part to the fact that he has twice been documented by authorities to be breaking our laws and illegally present in this country, yet they do nothing about it. To say that he is undocumented is a lie, but to say his presence in the United States is illegal is unambiguously true. You see, what we do is we now live by euphemism, lies, and censorship as the order of the day. Unvarnished truth, clear communication is not allowed because it hinders a narrative that is false that we're trying to promote as true. We now emphasize the trivial to the neglect of the consequential. Shortly after, you remember the transgender shooter that killed 6 people at a Nashville Christian school a few months ago, following her death, there were people that had the nerve to express outrage that the coverage of her massed killing included what they called posthumous misgendering and dead naming. Never mind all the dead people. Never mind the crime of actually killing children. The big outrage was that there was a dead mass murderer whose feelings were hurt because we used the wrong pronouns. Coming from a movement that claims to be primarily governed by sensitivity to feelings, it's both ironic and tragic that the progressive left is not concerned about feelings. They're only concerned about the approved feelings. Somehow, Lake and Riley's murderer can't be called illegal because it'll hurt his feelings, but nobody's apologizing to the family of the girl that was murdered because of a policy that allowed murderers to come in unnoticed into our country. A mass murderer gets an apology because we dead named her and used the wrong pronouns, and yet there are 6 families grieving the loss of children. Nobody seems to be worried about their feelings. The ideology and the inability to prioritize is dangerous anywhere, but it's especially so when it's running the White House. It's not just the White House, it's Congress. Congress has now passed what's called the AntiSemitism Awareness Act. Again, a legislative attempt to limit hate speech. All right, they're trying to deal with sort of the rampant problem today of anti-Semitism, particularly on college campuses. I get the motive. I understand why the impulse is there to do that. But this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that has just been sent to the Senate is, while it's an attempt to stem anti-Semitism, it is written in a typically sloppy way that is going to allow it someday to be weaponized in ways that have truly unintended consequences. For example, because the definition of anti-Semitism that they have used has been borrowed from an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the definition of anti-Semitic speech that they borrow to use in this bill can rightfully be understood to simply make the reading of the Bible, particularly those sections of the Gospels, for example, that speak about the Jews being responsible for killing Jesus, to simply stand in the pulpit as a pastor and read those verses out loud would be to cross the line of this bill and be liable for arrest for anti-Semitic speech. You see, I'm not in favor of anti-Semitism at all. We need to be huge supporters of Israel. But this is so sloppily done because we have a generation that manipulates language rather than protects language, that now this is just another means that's going to eventually be weaponized to control what can and cannot be said. Folks, we better figure out as Christians where we're going to stand on this issue of free speech. People say, well, there shouldn't be any speech that offends. You shouldn't be able to hurt anybody. Well, listen, you don't need free speech protections if there's not any speech that ever offends anybody. I mean, if everybody just holds hands and sings Kumbaya and we never say anything that's hard or difficult, anything that causes disagreement, then you don't need speech protections. The reason you put hate crime legislation into place is so that you can squelch speech, so that you can stop a message that you don't want to be delivered. And even under the guise of fighting against anti-Semitism, we have a legislative stick that can now be used to stop potentially Orthodox Christian speech that is not favored by those in power. You see, whether it's the language of the southern border or the language of the LGBTQ community or the language of anti-Semitic hate speech, all of these issues are tied together in this way. Words matter. And if you can control the way I can speak, then eventually you can control the way that I act, and finally you can actually reshape the way that I process information, the way that I think about reality. What does the Bible say? Well, let me give you a couple of places. In Psalm 146, verse 3, the psalmist says, "Do not trust in noblemen." That's a grand old word. We might substitute the word politician. "Do not trust in politicians, in mortal man in whom there is no salvation." Understand that politicians always have an agenda. They're always promoting a narrative, and we have to be careful about just how much authority we put in their hands to control the way we speak. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, speaking specifically about language within religious settings, Paul says, "For the time will come when they will not tolerate sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and will turn aside to myths." You see, when we devalue truth, we substitute it with agenda, ideology. And when ideology becomes the content of our speech, and speech is limited to that content, then culture becomes an expression of those in power who have the ability to restrict speech. We are living in a Romans chapter 1 culture. Romans 1 says that God made himself known to human beings, but they actively suppressed that truth, that revelation of God. And in doing so, God's response was to give them over to the nonsense of their minds, to the irrational reasonings of their brain. In other words, when a culture determines to reject truth, the result is they will then believe as truth any crazy idea that comes up. And the reality is, the church has to diligently find its way back to the Word of God. Pastors must rediscover the courage and the boldness to preach truth, because we now live in a culture where the media, the politicians, the cultural influencers are in collusion to accomplish one thing: to reshape the language that we use so they can control the narrative, the content of what we think, and thereby control how we act. I don't think I'll go to jail in my lifetime for speech crimes, although that may be more and more a possibility in the days ahead. But I will tell you this, if it comes to that, may God give me the strength and the courage to say what is true, even when everybody in authority around me tells me to speak lies. That's a decision. That's a decision up front that you, as a follower of Jesus Christ, need to make now. I will not live by lies. I will not speak in language that compromises truth. You say, this seems like a little bit of an esoteric, a kind of an obscure little issue. Folks, this is going to be a fundamental and foundational issue in the days ahead. Pay attention to the way those who set the agenda use language, and don't be fooled. Speak truth. Use words that mean something. And don't play the game of euphemisms, lies, and censorship. This is Truth Currents.